Ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome to the BlockCrunch podcast, the go-to podcast for investors and builders in crypto. This episode is also brought to you by PARASWAP. Stick around to learn more. Welcome back to another episode. I am currently in New York City after having just participated in the Mainnet conference, where I met over 100 people in crypto in person. Now, one of the most pertinent themes across all of these conversations was the emergence of decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs. And these are completely digital communities that rely on tokens to govern and transact. Now, Dows is still a very early field, and even though we've been talking about Dows since 2018 on this show, there's still not a lot of official resources. So in this episode, we're going to do a DAO 101, where we talk about what DAOs are, their legal standing, key stakeholders, key pitfalls, popular toolings, and examples of DAOs, and our thesis on DAOs in general. And to unpack all of this for newcomers and veterans alike, I'm very excited to have Cooper Trooper on the show. Now, Cooper is involved in multiple projects as a contributor and advisor, and he's involved early on with DAOs like Friends with Benefits, Pleaser DAO, Fingerprints DAO, and a whole lot more. And as one of the earliest operators and most vocal operators in DAOs, Cooper sheds light on over a dozen popular tools to build your own DAO, a few legal resources for those who want to do this properly, and specific tactics about scaling DAO communities. We also talk about the 11 DAOs that he's most excited about today, and at the very end, we're also going to discuss the one thing that Cooper regrets not doing earlier on in DAOs. So if there's one podcast that you listen to about DAOs, make sure it's this one. And before we jump into it, make sure you subscribe to the podcast as well. Now, in addition, I'm also starting a long-form newsletter to share my personal views on specific projects and theses. So if you're interested in that extra bit of alpha, head on over to my Twitter at Mr. Jason Choi and find the subscription link on the pinned tweet. Cooper Trooper, I'm super excited to have you on the show. How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful, man. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so I met you at Mainnet here in New York, where I still am, and you've gone back to LA now. First of all, how did you find Mainnet? Was it everything you expected? Anything surprising there?
Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, seeing everyone IRL that I've been hanging out with online for the past year was incredible. You know, it was nonstop 7 days. And I think spending time there really just showed you that people are really, really excited about what's going on. But there's so much design space to cover that you really need to be in the mix to keep up with everything going on.
Yeah, it's pretty insane as well, because I think I met with probably over 100 people, and in probably 50% of those conversations, someone brings up the concept of DAOs. So everybody's talking about DAOs right now. So let's kick us off by having you tell us, how did you get involved with DAOs, and what are you doing right now in crypto?
Yeah, so in 2019, I joined a grant giving DAO called Metacartel. At this point in time, I was putzing around the Ethereum ecosystem, trying to find a space to spend time and energy on. You know, I'd kind of come out of the bear market of 2017 as like a trader, and I was really looking to double down on something that was more substantial. So I found a group of individuals that were really focused on the app layer. They're really focused on mainstream adoption. And so I was doing a lot of writing and basically working my way into DAOs just to have skin in the game. You know, nowadays what I'm doing is working across a bunch of different internet communities, helping them stand up things like a Discord server, a token, a snapshot page, really going from 0 to 1 on how to decentralize and start a DAO. And then as that DAO matures, helping with organizational structure and governance to keep the ball rolling and help the DAO mature.
That's awesome. And you mentioned online communities. We're definitely going to dive into that. And with today's discussion, I'd love to give our listeners a kind of DAO 101 about what DAOs actually are, how they work, how they're going to grow, what are some common pitfalls. So there's so much to unpack here. So why don't we start with the very, very basics? What exactly is a DAO, and how is it different from, say, a Reddit forum or like a Discord server?
Yeah, I like to think of DAOs as internet communities with a shared bank account. I'll put emphasis on that shared bank account because I think the community treasury is what makes a DAO different from something like a Reddit subforum. You know, I think that having an asset that governs a shared capital pool allows a DAO to coordinate in a way that we haven't really seen before. And with that comes new things like paid roles, responsibilities, extra layers of social capital. You don't think it's distinct from Reddit or Discord where you have moderators, but now those people are able to get paid from that DAO. And as a result, collectively, they're able to build products and services, which separates it from the group chats of the past.
That's an awesome description. And what type of DAOs are there today? I think you mentioned before there's like DeFi DAOs and like social DAOs. What are the main categories out there? And can you give us some examples about, what these DAOs do?
Sure. So I'll just go off the top of my head here. I might be missing some, so please excuse me if I am. Protocol DAOs are kind of the most common ones. So these are giant protocols like Uniswap, Compound, Aave, these DeFi giants that have on-chain governance. They're managing billions of dollars of capital, and all governance is happening through on-chain votes. There's social clubs, which is things like FWB, C Club, Forefront, which are more, human-based first. You're basically coming into a group chat, you're finding new people to interact with. You may be building products and services together, but the core intention is really to meet other people rather than to do stuff on chain. You have grant giving DAOs, which are allocating capital towards a given ecosystem. You have service DAOs, which are people working for a DAO and contracting out work to kind of help advance the crypto ecosystem at large. You have media DAOs, which is kind of a new one that I'm excited about, where people are coming in and contributing to some sort of media vehicle and earning ownership in that outlet as a result. And then you have, dozens of others. Collector DAOs I think are important. Investment DAOs I think are important. You can kind of bucket all those under this shared capital pool where individuals will throw ETH into a treasury together, and they'll go out and acquire some sort of high value asset. Whether that's an NFT, whether that's investing in the seed round of a company. You're now seeing these investment clubs start to form as DAOs because I think it's much more efficient than the syndicate groups we've seen in the past. And there's now a dozen tools being built around that to enable those opportunities.
Yeah, and when the concept of DAOs first came about in 2016, it was really just a basic investment club where a bunch of people around the world pool capital and form this kind of decentralized VC fund. Would you say DAOs have evolved beyond just an investment use case? Have you seen things beyond just capital deployment?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that most DAOs get to a point where they are deploying capital, but out of the gate, a lot of the times it's starting from 3 to 5 people wanting to align on some sort of shared mission, most of which has nothing to do with actually making a profit or a return. So something like FWB, for example, was created as a Discord server to invite creative minds to come talk about crypto. There was no intention of making money off that. There was no intention of building products and services. It was basically a home base for anyone that was interested in culture to come and have an open discussion about that. I think what you're seeing more and more now is that as these brands and sub communities start DAOs, they're less focused on profiting off of their likeness and more just on connecting the individual members. And so I like to think of a DAO as a way to really solidify online relationships. And as you get deeper in those relationships, be able to find working opportunities that you can earn from working for the brands that you know and love.
And can you tell us how these DAOs are better than traditional corporate structures? So if, say, a bunch of people are interested in a topic together, why shouldn't they just start maybe an LLC to, pull some capital and deploy that capital versus, spinning out a DAO?
Yeah, so I think relative to an LLC, when you're starting a DAO, it's a lot easier to show on-chain identity. It's easier to show that people have different assets which represent ownership in these communities. They're able to coordinate on a much different level. And whereas in NFT or DAO or LLC of the past kind of had a bunch of people with the shared skin in the game through equity, I think the ability to take that on-chain and utilize all these tools and services allows those relationships to go much deeper. Typically, I don't think that you are going to issue new shares to every community member that pops into your group. But I think with a DAO, it's much easier to issue fluid ownership to people who are adding value in some way, shape, or form. And so that net is able to expand much faster. And as a result, I think that the value is able to accrue much heavier as well.
Would you say that fluid ownership is kind of the 0 to 1 innovation for DAOs, or are there other key things that make them superior in these use cases than a traditional corporate structure?
I think that's the primary thing. I think transparency is really important here. So as I mentioned before, I see the community treasury as kind of the reason why DAOs are doing so well right now. Having this one wallet, which holds the vast majority of the assets that everyone has a say over. There's definitely been, company bank accounts for years and years in the past. That's not a new concept. But I think the new concept is that whenever things of value are happening from that treasury, allowing people to participate in those discussions is very different from retroactively saying what happened via some sort of retrospective investor update. And so as someone who's in a community, you feel much more involved in those decisions. And as you feel like you have meaningful governance say in what's happening, you'll typically find that people are willing to invest more time, energy, and capital because they feel like they have an ownership stake in that community. And as a result, I think the value of that community grows much faster than it would if you were just issuing equity to people involved.
That makes sense. And there's been so many interesting examples of DAOs. I'd really love to get into the specifics here. And you're personally involved with a lot of them as well, including Pleaser DAO, Fingerprints DAO, Friends with Benefits DAO. So I'd love for you to kind of just take any one of these that excite you and then talk about, how did it get started? How did you get involved? And how are you involved with them on a day-to-day basis? Or how are people participating?
Yeah, I'll use Friends with Benefits because it's the one most near and dear to my heart. So about a year ago today, the founder, Trevor McFedries, was in a group chat with me. I heard that he was starting a culture crypto DAO. We met up for coffee here in LA and just talked about, what does it mean to sort of abstract all the tech layers of crypto and just offer something that was very basic to a wide, audience of users. We basically said, we're all farming different DeFi pools out here. We're all doing this degenerate stuff, but there's not really a home for people who have a creative mind to just come and hang out. And so the start of that DAO was literally as simple as buy tokens to join a token gated Discord. And within that token gated Discord, we're going to make room for conversation for whatever our members want to talk about. From there is a very iterative process of listening and learning to what community members wanted to discuss. So anything from NFTs to tokens to a good morning channel to a lifestyle channel to an LA channel, it's very much just a responsive pattern of trying to make sure that our members felt like they were getting value out of the group that they spent their time in. I think that as time went on, we noticed that when the group got bigger, we had to add more maturity layers to it. So things like adding a membership committee to help facilitate onboarding, things like hiring curators and events programmers to make sure that everything was functioning smoothly. And now more recently, we've gotten to a point where we've had the opportunity to fundraise for some incredible firms. And so naturally, as the result of that, the DAO has now had to incorporate. We're having to go through conversations around tax structuring and doing more legacy structures like healthcare and stuff that you don't really think about as a DAO. But it's been really exciting to go from token gated Discord chat, buy tokens on Uniswap and get in 5 minutes to now go through this fluid onboarding process, be vetted by a membership community, have the opportunity to join and work for a meaningful capital allocation and start to build things that are really, really significant.
That is so interesting. And I'd love to spin that into talking about how people can start a DAO. So someone listening out there, if they want to start a DAO there, is there a basic DAO stack today where there's, maybe a bunch of tools that are the most popular for people to use when they build out DAOs? Or is it still pretty much a Wild West? You have to kind of build out all the tooling yourself?
There's a ton of tooling, but I'll say that it's evolving every day. 3 months ago, I think starting a social token and adding a snapshot page for governance was sufficient to be able to get the ball off the ground. I think now there's a lot of discussion around NFTs versus social token as kind of the primary currency. There's a bunch of new tools coming out for DAO governance, but to really boil it down, I would say that having a Gnosis safe multisig is the home base for your DAO assets, having some form of a token that represents governance over those assets, and having a snapshot page to be able to do governance are kind of the first things that I think are necessary to get this off the ground. As you go a little bit deeper, you start to look into compensation tools like SourceCred and Coordinate. So ways to be able to pay contributors in an open source fashion. You start to look across the board at different NFT protocols that you can use to sort of align community and issue NFTs and help the collectors. And then last but not least, you try and have these different segments to be able to add group chats in a meaningful way. So these are more off-chain tools. So things like starting Discord bots, things like doing things with Figma, or doing things with like group collabs like Mural, basically tools that allow your contributors to sort of facilitate with one another. I think that in aggregate, it's both a combination of on-chain tooling to support governance and off-chain tooling to support human coordination.
And are you of the camp that all these DAOs should be completely decentralized? They shouldn't use any Web 2 tooling? Or do you think it makes more sense for DAOs to make use of things that are already popular, like Discord or Telegram, or things that are a bit more centralized?
I'm of the latter camp. I think that for most people, an entirely on-chain world is still very scary to them. I think that we still have a long ways to go before this tech is really ready to be Web3 only. And so for a lot of these DAOs, I think they are human first, technology second. And with that in mind, I think it's okay to rely on tools that people have used for years in the past, because realistically, those companies are extremely well funded and they've built really killer products. I think trying to add in Web3 when necessary makes a lot of sense, but not being restrictive to only using Web3 allows your community to really organize in a way that you just couldn't do if you're only using on-chain tooling today.
That makes sense. So now I think we have a pretty good sense about what tools people need to use to start a DAO. You talked about Gnosis, you talked about Snapshot, SourceFed, Coordinate, and some of these group chat functionalities as well. So let's talk about the people now. When you spin out a DAO, what are the key stakeholders that you need to set out in the very beginning?
There's a role that I like that's being circulated in the ecosystem right now called Chief Community Officer. I really want to emphasize this because I found that more times than not, when a DAO makes its first hire, it's often for this community leadership position. So someone who's kind of coordinating and organizing across the wider DAO, sharing proposals, sharing group updates, liaison of different team calls and different town halls, someone who's basically at the center of the DAO and really whose job it is to just connect the dots to one another. I think that is the single most important hire. From there, you sort of branch down into different sub-DAOs, I'll call it, or different branches of a DAO, which resemble very traditional companies. So things like having a CTO, things like having a product lead, things like having someone running editorial, membership, treasury management. I think these roles are all very similar to what you would see in a typical crypto company, but they're now being hired in a much different way. Rather than having a one-on-one discussion with someone who's running hiring, it'll typically be an open governance process with the community. That person will go through a vetting process, really speak to other members of the DAO. And slowly but surely, over the course of a couple of weeks, you'll then see a proposal on a snapshot forum where, the DAO is basically asking the community to vote yes or no on employing someone for a very key position in that DAO.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting is that the roles you mentioned, right? CTO, product lead, these are traditional roles you'd find in, companies or other crypto projects that may not be DAOs as well. So obviously these DAOs are competing for talent against tech
Hmm.
companies and other crypto products. So how should a DAO incentivize these stakeholders, and what type of tools and what type of structure should they use?
I think ownership of tokens is the obvious example here. So in the same way that you would give someone a vested equity package for joining a company, doing that but with tokens over a shorter time horizon in a much more fluid manner is extremely attractive. So we now have tools like Sablier and like Superfluid where you can stream these tokens in real time to contributors. And using that as sort of an incentive to get involved, I think is really powerful. What I've noticed work well is going from being a passive contributor to having a small token grant for a fixed one-off project to then working into more of a full-time long-term token vest has been a really nice maturity pattern. So I think rather than trying to hire people immediately out of the gate to be full-time in a key executive role of the community, it's much better for them to spend time getting to meet the members, doing small projects here and there, building trust, and then once they've had a strong standing in that community, evolving and advancing them into a key leadership position. With that, I think comes a series of compensation discussions, but I'm really into this idea of teal organizations, which TLDRs allow people to self-identify and self-define their own compensation. And so rather than having fixed job listing where it's like X salary per month and Y% of ownership, having a one-on-one conversation with that person and be like, what do you think that you're worth? How many hours do you want to put in this month? Do you want to be full-time on this? What is your transition from your traditional job into working for a DAO? It's a much more iterative process. And I found that when you go through that process with people, they feel much more comfortable in how they're being compensated because they help to decide that themselves. And as a result, they can really focus on what matters rather than worrying about how many dollars they're earning.
Yeah, thank you for that very practical advice. And you also mentioned this very interesting term, this you're standing in the community. So how much of these hiring decisions is community based where you have to, poll the whole community to decide whether we can hire this person? And how much of that is basically just a centralized team in the beginning, finding people and hiring as if they would in a normal company?
The reality is that most of these DAOs, key decisions are being made by a few small core contributors. I think ambitiously over time this will get wider, but I actually believe that the role of the community is around transparency more than it is around key decision making. I think trying to involve more than 20 people over key decisions is a very slow burden. But what you can do is present something that feels like a good idea and make sure that you're getting sign off from them. And so typically what you'll see is there are anywhere from 1 to 3 people who are kind of being the talent scout for that DAO. They're working with these contributors to help bring them in the door, to help solidify proposals, to get them onboarded, to help define their job spec and their compensation. And once that's been put in place through a few internal conversations, they'll then take that to the community and have the community vote on that. I think that process is much more effective than starting from a place of YOLOing to a community asking how much I should get paid and doing a Discord vote with 1,000 members on your salary. It allows it to be a much more confined conversation. And then when you do go to that community, it's much easier for them to say yes or no to something just because they know that person already. You didn't really have to go through a lot of like the back and forth discussions on compensation. It's very much like a social signaling thing. And I actually have never seen a well-oriented DAO contributor proposal be shot down through governance so long as there's been transparency along the way. And so long as that vote feels like it's very open and active with the community.
Now, before I continue, I'd love to share one of my favorite products in crypto with you. Now, whenever I want to trade a token, instead of going to Uniswap, SushiSwap, Bancor one by one to see where I can find the best quote, I just go to PARASWAP to scan for the best price anywhere. Because PARASWAP aggregates all the popular Ethereum dexes and saves me a ton of time and headache in finding where I can trade something for the best price, and lets me trade in one place. Now, the cool thing is they've also integrated with Ledger Live as well, meaning I can now swap at the best prices directly from my Ledger wallet. So seriously, if you're a DeFi trader and you're worried about the security risks of centralized exchanges, but you also don't want to scour dozens of dexes just to find the best price, you have to check out PARASWAP. So head on over to paraswap.io/blockcrunch. Yeah, and speaking of governance, besides these core contributors, the other stakeholders are obviously the community members, right? People who vote on these things, people who participate in the forums. What is the process for people to join DAOs today? Are there kind of gates where people have to hold a certain number of tokens, or is it kind of free for all right now?
It's definitely free for all. I would say that every DAO varies in how new contributors are able to be onboarded. I think most DAOs do have some sort of token gated threshold level. So if you join a Discord server, there is some opportunity for you to become deeper in that conversation by holding a specific asset. I think there's a variance on if that token gate is required to join in the first place. So for example, something like FWB, You do need some tokens to get access to the full Discord, but something like Forefront, you can hop in and start contributing with absolutely zero capital allocation. And so across the board, it definitely varies. But I would say for most of these DAOs, there is sort of a core contributor group, which identifies people who are adding value to that DAO. There are paid roles, both socially and financially, that allow you to be seen as a leader in that community. And then more broadly, there are generally these private pockets where core DAO members are having very intimate discussions about sensitive information, frankly. And I think those inner chats are kind of what defines the parameters of a DAO. And then more socially, there are typically assets which you can buy into at any amount, but the level to which you're actually a part of that DAO directly correlates to how active you are on a day-to-day basis.
That's interesting. And in general, would you advise DAOs to have some sort of token gate for participation, or should they all be open for all?
I've found that smaller working groups with trusted assets work much better than wide open permissionless structures. I think that exclusivity is really delicate here because you can get to a state where it becomes very difficult to join. But I'm way more bullish on there being 1,000 DAOs that all have 10 to 50 members in them than I am on having one DAO that has 100,000 members into it. And so when I talk to people about starting their DAO, I think there's a lot of interest and excitement around doing 10,000 PFP projects, having 10,000 members in a DAO. But realistically, you see that once you get past the threshold of, let's call it 300 members, it's very difficult to maintain the quality of conversation. And so I actually have been encouraging a lot of people to start very small with the way that you kick off that DAO, have it be a working group of like 20 members and very naturally build out, which is contrary to thinking where you might just launch a project and just drop 10,000 people into a Discord and then you have a DAO. When in reality, I think that if you were to follow that structure, it would get very shitty very fast. And I don't think that's very positive for starting a sustainable DAO.
And how important would you say is the founder as almost a figurehead in rallying the community? Because if you look at DeFi, you have these icons, people like Kane from Synthetics, that really hold the community together, and people seem to rally around him. But at the same time, I guess the critique for projects or DAOs that are oriented around one person is that the decisions might be disproportionately swayed by singular people. So from what you've observed from all these DAOs, how important is it for founders to be very, very actively engaging in these communities? And how important is it for them to kind of step out and let the community be more organic?
It's a great question. I think at first it is entirely necessary for there to be a figurehead that's driving support in that community. So getting the ball off the ground, having one key leader who's seen as the person of influence in the group, I think that's fundamentally necessary for it to gain traction. But the core challenge for that leader is how quickly can you remove yourself for that conversation and still have the ball be moved forward in a very meaningful way. So whereas you might start from that key person being the sole person driving governance proposals, being the key communicator in a Discord chat, I think you'll notice that for successful DAOs, over the course of the next couple of months, that leader will only be one of many who have a voice in that community. And the best thing that they can do is create systems and channels for other people to step into leadership roles as well. And as you sort of disintermediate that one person in favor of having multiple contributors with a strong voice in the community, you're going to notice that people feel far more likely to participate and engage because they recognize that if they put in the time and effort, they can also have a meaningful stake and a voice in this community.
That makes sense. And speaking of stake, I'd love to also touch on governance as well. How do people govern DAOs today? Is it usually a one token, one vote type of situation? Have you seen any other alternatives that you're personally fond of as well?
It's absolutely a one token, one vote situation. I think all of the most interesting things with DAO are happening off chain right now. I think on chain, there's very little happening from a governance or staking standpoint. I do believe we'll get to a point where these DAOs are doing a lot more delegation, staking, curation on chain, whatever you want to call it. But what I'm spending the most time on is scaling the human side of DAOs and scaling the organizational structure of them as to make sure that people are getting paid, as to make sure that people have good opportunities to get involved and that onboarding is clean and smooth. And from there, I think it matters less how you're voting on something and more about the fact that you're doing that openly with the community. And I think that that's why we've seen this one token, one vote governance model work so well so far. It's because for a lot of these social clubs, it's much more about participating, the quantity of participants rather than the quantity of tokens that are voting. And oftentimes, if you have a strong gel in your community, you're seeing all of these votes passing with overwhelming support. And I don't think that would change if you had a different governance structure, which is why the human side has been so interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I'd love for you to talk more about that. In terms of the human side, what are some of the most interesting observations there, or some of the biggest challenges you've come across when you're trying to improve the human side of these DAOs?
The biggest challenge for me has been there are so many people that are eager and excited to join a DAO, both from a passive perspective and from an active contribution perspective. Finding ways to onboard everyone who wants to add meaningful value to a DAO is extremely difficult. So on any given day in FWB, we'll probably have 50 to 100 people who are all really keen to contribute to some project, but finding a place for them to do that in a meaningful way that doesn't slow down things or involve them in conversations that are already ongoing has been very challenging. So a lot of what I spend my time on now is thinking through onboarding processes. So when you first drop into a DAO, how do you have someone better welcome you to that community? How do you better identify where to spend your time on? And then as you want to go into a contributor role, how do you create pockets such that it's very easy for you to get involved without having to worry about relying on one specific person? That's kind of the key gatekeeper to whether or not you're able to work for a paid position for a DAO.
And after you onboard these people, I'm assuming there might be some sort of organizational structure where there is some sort of manager, especially for these sub DAOs. Are you seeing a replication of a traditional corporate structure where you have a manager or product manager and then a few engineers under that person? Or is it mostly still very kind of Wild West and organic?
It's starting to resemble that. What I'm seeing is most times a sub DAO will have a defined leader, so a leader who is voted in through governance. That leader is responsible for overseeing other contributors to that working group, and then using a tool like Coordinate, the contributors of that circle are able to come together and define compensation. But I think that for most of these sub DAOs, having a key leader allows there to be responsibility and sort of decision making that rests on the hands of one person. And then I think it's going to resemble, the overarching DAO structure. We're similar to what we talked about before, kicking off a DAO, you have one person who's sort of seen as the key figurehead for that DAO. Over time, they disintermediate and there's more leaders of that community. I think the same structure applies to a sub DAO. You elect one leader, they're overseeing a group of contributors, but then as that kind of sub circle gets more popular, they will be seen less as the key decision maker, and there will be other people that rise to power to help architect and lead that division.
That makes sense. And I'd also love to touch on this other point that a lot of founders ask us, which is, what is the legal designation of a DAO, right? When they spin out a DAO, should they be setting it up as some sort of LLC or some sort of foundation? Is there any type of legal framework around DAOs today? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
It's very, very undefined. Across the board, I think that every DAO is undergoing this conversation in a very different way right now. FWB, we recently incorporated as a C Corp, where the DAO owns a C corporation that allows us to have a bank account and make payments in the real world. I've seen LLC structures, I've seen foundation structures. I think for me, I welcome a world in which we can use entirely on chain tools and structures to self organize. But the reality is that right now, all DAOs are beholden to some sort of regulation standard to be able to pay taxes, to be able to pay employees, to offer healthcare. And so we're kind of in this middle ground world right now where DAOs are happening on chain and they're really crypto native, but they're relying on traditional legacy structures to be able to function and comply with sort of regulation and law. And so I honestly don't have a perfect solution for someone that's starting a DAO. I think every law firm that you work with will have a different opinion on what you should do best. And I would say it's really just about spending the time to make sure that as you enter into those conversations about legal structuring, that you feel you're working with a firm that's highly competent in this new world and setting yourselves up to be highly adaptable to whatever happens moving forward.
And are there any legal resources that, DAO founders often tap into, or any firms that people tend to use, or any kind of resources that you recommend for people?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll caveat by saying all these firms I'm going to list are extremely busy right now, and so I would say with caution that it's going to be difficult to land an engagement. But I've really enjoyed working with the team at Fenwick. I think they're fantastic. I've done a number of token launches with them so far, and they've been really awesome about setting up corporations, foundation, treasuries, legal structure around token launches. We're currently engaged with a firm called Cooley at FWB. They've been doing a fantastic job. After interface with the team at Goodwin, and there's a couple others here and there. There's small firms popping up every now and then to help out. I'll give a quick shout out to my friend Ruben, who's been doing kind of this pseudo DAO legal advice for people, just sort of helping to get things off the ground. But it's a wild west out there. It's a very new world, and I think that for the vast majority of legal firms, understanding the mechanics of a fully on-chain native community is very new to them. And so I would say have patience. Expect to spend a lot of time finding the right legal partner, but they do exist. You really just have to put the time and effort into finding them and rely very heavily on recommendations from industry leaders to be able to facilitate those relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for those recommendations. And this is a question that I think you posted as well that you wanted to discuss. And I'm super curious about what your thoughts here. But it is, how do DAOs scale? I know it's a very general question, but I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, as we said earlier, I think that following this sort of sub DAO branching model has been what I've seen to be most effective so far. I think doing batched waves of new contributors is really important. So I don't think DAOs scale by having open floodgates where anyone can join at any given time. I think you need to have people manning the door. So things like membership committees, things like onboarding committees, having ways to indoctrinate and onboard members in a very tailored fashion. you want to make sure that as people are joining the DAO, they actually feel like they have a meaningful stake in it. And so having just an open channel where anyone's joining at ease isn't really going to be beneficial as you grow. What will be beneficial is making sure you're always focusing on hiring key contributors. So onboarding people who are spending all of their time and effort on a DAO, and then creating systems for those key contributors to onboard additional members from there. And so you almost start to see this branch out model where you have, similar to like, let's call it the beacon chain ETH2 or something like that. You have the DAO as sort of like the core home base. And then you have all of these sub chains or these kind of sub pockets where people are working and coordinating together, but all of that rolls up and reports back to the home base over time. And I think if you look at this over like a year or two time horizon, you're going to notice that all these DAOs have 5 to 10 different subdivisions, but all of those subdivisions are kind of rolling up into the main DAO through governance and through a community treasury. I think that's how we scale and get to, DAOs that are now managing billions of dollars of capital.
That's very useful. So batched waves of introducing contributors and also a sub-DAO structure. These are things that I think will be super useful for founders out there. And I think we've focused enough on kind of people trying to start DAOs. I love to focus on community members who are trying to get involved with DAOs. So just generally, first of all, how should someone get started if they suddenly want to explore the concept of DAOs?
I think by listening, I think that there's an obvious reaction to want to immediately get involved in a DAO and do everything you can to be seen as a member of it. But the reality is there is a learning curve associated with every community. You need to be willing to spend the time to sit in that Discord channel, see who's making the most conversation, see who's really leading that DAO, and just being present of what that structure looks like. From there, I think there's a lot of small things that you can do to help. So going to town hall meetings, going to contributor meetings and taking notes, really making sure that you're doing things that relays information to a wider community. If you spend your time finding a community that you're really passionate about and you show that you're active in helping disseminate information, chances are someone in that community will notice that and reward that very heavily. I think the wider question here is how do you find your first DAO to join? And to this, I would say there are tools like Forefront, which are doing a fantastic job of creating profiles around different DAOs. There are media outlets now like NFT Now, which are covering a bunch of awesome sectors. There are newsletters out there that are covering this every day. And so I would say beyond thinking about how to actually join a DAO once you get involved, I would spend the time to really do your diligence on what's out there today. Try and identify 1 to 2 key communities that you feel very passionate about and just pay attention. Get in the Discord server, sit around, go to a couple meetings, see if you like the vibe of it. And if you do, I think very quickly you'll notice who is contributing the most value. And with a couple DMs and a couple meeting notes, I think you'll find that people are excited to get you involved. And from there, the path really isn't that difficult at all.
And from your experience in onboarding all these new community members, what would you say are the most common steps where you see them kind of struggle a little bit?
Getting started. I think, like I said before, people are often dropped into a Discord server with no means of navigating the community. They're very overwhelmed by how many structures and channels there are. They're overwhelmed by all the different events going on. And so I would say, both as a challenge to people getting involved and to people running DAOs, we need to make it easier for people to know what's happening and where to point their attention once they start and actually join a DAO. So rather than just dropping them into a general channel and telling them to make an introduction, working closely with them to help direct their attention to something that they're very passionate about. So let's call it NFTs, lifestyle, whatever it might be, and creating pockets for them to get involved in a really meaningful way. I think that that's the single biggest issue we have with DAOs across the board right now. And I actually don't think we've seen a lot of structure to help with that quite yet.
That makes a lot of sense. That was actually going to be my next question, which is what would you say in general are some of the most common pitfalls that DAOs face today, both on the community front and on the stakeholder front?
Yeah, so onboarding is definitely first and foremost top of mind for me. I think right now it's still very difficult to get involved with the DAO, from downloading a MetaMask wallet, setting up a Discord account, buying a token off of Uniswap or OpenSea, connecting that wallet to Collabland to actually join a token gated role. That process requires like level 7 wizardry of crypto. I think in the future, it should be able to be done in about 5 minutes or less. I would say more broadly, finding the right mesh around open source contribution is really important. Right now, we rely on a model where if you want to get paid from a DAO, there typically needs to be an active conversation with the core contributor. There needs to be funnels in place for you to be able to create open proposals to the community. And there need to be pockets for you to be able to voice those opinions so you can actually get paid for what you're working on. I think over time, we'll get into a place where it's more automated and it's less about getting sign off from a core contributor to be able to do value added work for a community, and more about an open and fluid flow where things can be proposed through governance. And there never has to be a one-on-one sit down like this for an hour to make sure you get paid. That process should be much more fluid and it should be easier to pick up work and get paid from working on the communities that you love.
That makes sense. And for this last part of the discussion, I think our community really wants to get to know you, Cooper. So Could you talk about some DAOs that you are personally super excited for, and what do these DAOs do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just go ahead and start off the top of my head. I'm going to go on a monologue here for a minute or two, but let's see where we go with it. So, Friends with Benefits, culture crypto community, absolutely love it. I've met so many incredible people through it. And if you're looking to really see what this looks like at the cutting edge, there is literally no better place to start working. Forefront DAO Port of Entry. So, as an onboarding place to get started with the DAO world, I absolutely love the work they're doing there. They have a fantastic newsletter to keep up with. I'm very active with a DAO called Seed Club, which is a social token incubator. They're currently working on a new cohort with about 12 projects that will all be launching DAOs very soon that I'm very, very excited about. The Bankless DAO has been doing an incredible job of activating community members. They just kicked off a new season, which is fantastic. Pleaser DAO has some crazy projects in the works right now that I think everyone's going to be excited about. Keep an eye out for them from sort of the cultural NFT collection standpoint. Fingerprints DAO for deep NFT collectors is fantastic. I'll call out Bright Moments DAO, which is more of an IRL DAO to be able to join and collect NFTs and share around that experience. What else do I want to give a shout out to? The Super Rare DAO, I think, is going to get really interesting here soon. They just started the space races, which allowing people to onboard and create a space for them to curate NFTs under the Super Rare brand. A lot of the DeFi DAOs are starting to become very fascinating to me. So things like Index Co-op, things that allow you to get involved in a meaningful level. Bunch of new DAOs which are coming out of the works right now. There's going to be a lot of stuff in music popping up here very soon from like a label standpoint, from a curation standpoint. I'll call out Song Camp, which is an awesome DAO for musicians to come together and help coordinate with one another. Paperclip DAO is fascinating from a collector standpoint. There's a bunch of investment clubs now that I think are really, really exciting. I just saw one last week called Red DAO, which is like an on-chain fashion DAO, which is really exciting to me. And I mean, as you can tell, like I could literally talk about this endlessly. I think that the question is less about like which ones am I excited about and more so which ones are you passionate by. I very much see my role right now as being aware of highly valuable DAOs that exist in the ecosystem and making sure that I'm putting energy and attention towards other people being able to discover them. And if I can kind of put myself in this aggregator role and allow people to have a top-down overview of all the DAOs that exist today, I think that we'll be able to find a world in which it's much easier to get involved. And as a result of that, I think that there's a lot of stuff you'll be able to do to start working on things that you really love and earn a very, very handsome compensation in return with that.
Absolutely. And when you get involved in most of these DAOs, is there usually a very high kind of barrier to entry where you need to buy a lot of tokens? Because I think we've all heard the stories about DAOs that now cost 30 to 50 Ethereum ETH to join. Is that the case for most of these DAOs, or are they mostly still kind of open for all?
All the best DAOs that you will join will have no high barrier to entry, and you will join them very early in their life cycle. So I think the reason that you see these DAO entry points become so high is because the quality of them has gotten so valuable that now a lot of people want to join. The reality is, if you are new to DAOs and you're looking to really make a name for yourself in this industry, that's going to happen by you being a part of a DAO extremely early on in its life cycle before anyone knows what it is. So I would say rather than only trying to rely on joining ones that are already, brand names, find things that you can join that are extremely new and find ways to contribute to that. Because if you have a meaningful stake in a community that then becomes valuable, that ownership will be worth exponentially more than you trying to accumulate a very small piece of a DAO that already exists today.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's definitely a lot of parallels to investing as well, kind of finding early opportunities and trying to amass a large enough stake. So that definitely requires a lot of research. And I think this episode would be a great introduction to that research process. Now, my penultimate question to you is actually from the community. What do you wish you would have done differently when you started now that you've been involved in a few DAOs already?
It's a great question. I think I would focus heavier on 1 to 2 key DAOs. I'm in a position now where I'm across like a ton of DAOs every day, and I really love that. I think if I could do it differently, I would probably try and just double down on ownership stakes in 1 to 2 communities a lot heavier. Through that, I think it would be easier for me to really dive down this rabbit hole faster. I'm very thankful for my opportunity to work across a lot of DAOs, but I also notice with that comes an inability to go super deep on specific topics. And so if I were starting today, I would focus less on joining 5 DAOs and more about finding one DAO that I'm really passionate about and working into a very key contribution role in that single entity.
And if you would have to join that one DAO today, which one would it be?
It doesn't exist yet.
Doesn't exist yet. Well, I'm excited to see which one it ends up being. And so for people who want to keep following you to make sure that they find out which one it is, what are the best channels for them to do so?
Best channel to follow me would be on Twitter at Koopa Troopa. If you're looking to go down the DAO rabbit hole, Discords where everything's happening, I'm at Koopa Troopa number 9799 on there. If you made it this far in the episode, please shoot me a message. I would love to help you get involved with your first DAO. And I think based on this conversation, it's easy to tell that there's a lot going on out there. And I think now it's really just a matter of you being able to find things that excite you and really focusing your attention on one or two key things that are really important.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm going to plug your handle in the show notes below as well. But once again, Koopa, thank you so much for taking the time for joining us. This has been phenomenal.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I look forward to listening to this soon.